Hi, I'm Jackie Cohen-Ross, founder, CEO of CannabizMD. Welcome to another CannabizMD video profile. Today, I am joined by George Hodgin. George is the founder and CEO of Biopharmaceutical Research Company, a fully licensed DEA compliant company developing active pharmaceutical ingredients, or API, for plant-based therapeutics. And primarily, we're going to be talking about cannabis today. George is a former Navy SEAL officer, a graduate of the Stanford University Graduate School of Business, and an undergraduate at North Carolina Chapel Hill. George's colleague and laboratory director, Dr. Brandley, will be joining the CannabizMD Science and Therapeutics Provider Education Forum on September 25th, and he will be joining us on the roundtable, The Future of Medical Cannabis. This roundtable will examine the intersection of the traditional cannabis industry, the traditional healthcare industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the technology industry. And as I say, the future is here and now, and George and I are going to be going into a bit of that in just a bit. BRC is a pharmaceutical manufacturing and analytic firm focused on the production of cannabis for researchers across the U.S. And what is particularly exciting for BRC is that it is one of four. George is going to give us some more insight into this. Companies that were recently awarded by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, a memorandum of agreement award that the BRC will be supplying THC cannabis for researchers. Up until now, or when BRC and its others have their first harvest, up until now, the University of Mississippi was supplying researchers for about the last 50 years with cannabis. And again, this was the only organization that was licensed by the DEA to supply cannabis to researchers. And the cannabis that was applied by, or has been supplied by, University of Mississippi is renowned in the cannabis industry for not having any similarity pretty much to what is for sale and offered to medical cannabis patients as well as consumers. So we'll be learning more about the process, what George and BRC took to get where they are today, and what the future holds for them. So welcome, George.
Thank you so much, Jackie. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited to spend some time with you, and looking forward to having Dr. Brandley participate in the forum in a couple weeks.
Yeah, thank you. So give some clarity to what I just ran through as far as this DEA, where my understanding the awards, this was started under the Obama administration. There was a pause under the Trump administration, which was led by the former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, coming out with some very threatening pronouncements for the cannabis industry. So this was lay fallow until then. The Biden administration jumped relatively quickly to get these awards going again.
Yeah, so I'll take a step back and explain some of the context there, but we're really excited and proud and honored at BRC to be among the first federally legal cannabis companies in the United States. We think
congratulations. It's quite a feat.
Thank you.
Yeah,
it is a feat, and it's a responsibility we take really seriously and are excited and enthusiastic about what we can accomplish, not just for sort of the cannabis industry writ large, but for all the patients that need access to legitimate, well-researched cannabis products around the country. So I'll provide some context and color to the table you just set so well. So despite the fact that 200 million American consumers live in a state where they can access cannabis as a consumer from a dispensary or a delivery service, researchers, universities, biotech companies, and pharmaceutical companies effectively cannot. And the reason is that, unlike the consumer, those institutions are regulated by federal law. And under federal law, one has to purchase cannabis from a DEA, or any controlled substance really, but in this instance, obviously Schedule I cannabis. They have to purchase or receive their cannabis from a DEA authorized Schedule I manufacturer. Historically, as you pointed out, for nearly 60 years, only the University of Mississippi was the recipient of a DEA Schedule I cannabis production license. The DEA actually calls it a Schedule I bulk manufacturer of marijuana registration is the technical term. And in 2016, as you pointed out, the Obama administration, led by the DEA, led by the DEA actually, and under a lot of pressure from Congress and advocates, said, hey, this doesn't make sense. 200 million Americans are accessing this drug. We should have more people producing it and have varieties and different products, different cultivars, et cetera. And so that launched a multi-year process that really culminated in about the early summer of this year, 2021, with BRC's award as one of the first companies to receive a Schedule I manufacturing license for cannabis. So we're really excited about it.
Okay. And so would you put where was your founding of BRC and what you saw as an opportunity? How does that align with what we were just talking about with the context of the history of the award?
Excuse me. I served, as you mentioned, for about 7 years as a Navy SEAL officer. Mm-hmm. And when I was at graduate school, got involved in healthcare of a very dear friend of mine, a fellow special operations veteran and teammate. And this teammate was really pursuing alternative healthcare treatments. They were sick and tired of the opioid cocktail that they were being prescribed and really at the end of the rope and needed another option. And so I got involved in my friend's healthcare and was with this person at the VA and at the Veterans Affairs hospital. And my friend and teammate said to the doctor, hey, I'm going to try this medical marijuana thing. Can you just tell me how much to use and where do I get it and how it's going to interact with the other drugs that you've prescribed me? And the doctor said, hey, look, at the end of the day, it's not going to kill you, but as a physician, it would be really irresponsible for me to counsel you on cannabis use when we really don't know a lot about drug-drug interactions, how it's going to affect someone who's predisposed to some of the conditions that you're disposed to. It'd be really irresponsible for me to do that as a physician. And I'm sort of sitting back taking notes on behalf of my teammate. And I thought to myself, hey, wait a minute. So Jeff Sessions says it's effectively the same as heroin. Meanwhile, all my classmates are getting cannabis delivered to them through, a service like Ease, where it shows up like Uber Eats. What do you mean nobody's like really effectively researching the traditional medical and therapeutic implications of this? And he went on to explain a little bit of the context that I just shared with you around the importance of a Schedule I license and what that means to be federally approved to do controlled substance research. And I found that there was this incredible gap in the research community for someone that could provide compliant, consistent, and clean cannabis for researchers around the world. And so that's what at BRC, what we set out to do about 3 years ago. And it's been quite the journey, but it's really exciting where it's taken us. And really now we can we're at the point now where from a regulatory perspective, we can start achieving our dream and looking at alternative healthcare treatments for cannabis patients. Obviously, since our founding story and what's near and dear to me is looking at veteran healthcare, that's a lot of what we spend time thinking about. But the implications, as you know, and as the viewers know, are just so broad and in depth that it's not exclusively limited to veteran health or chronic pain, things of that nature. So we're really excited about the future.
Yeah, and then tell us something about the growing conditions. That my understanding is BRC has an indoor grow, and why versus growing outside, and I think Mississippi is outside.
That with respect to BRC, that's correct. I can't say with certainty about the University of Mississippi's growing conditions. My understanding from some public reporting is that they do a little bit of indoor grow and largely outdoor grow. But for us, there's two reasons why we decided to go down the indoor grow path. One is, and the most important is really the quality of the product for the patient or the researcher. The second is kind of a regulatory concern. So on the latter, on the regulatory concern, the DEA, particularly when it comes to producing a Schedule I drug, is very, very concerned. By law, it's their mandate that they're very focused on diversion, on security of your product, security of your personnel, standard operating procedures, et cetera. And so from an indoor grow perspective, it's just easier to manage and effectively to answer the DEA's mandate to prevent the diversion of your product. So that's one reason why. The more important and I think compelling reason why is, frankly, if you're a researcher or an investigator, the quality of your inputs is going to determine the quality of your science. And so with an outdoor grow, it's really challenging to standardize and homogenize the consistency of the product. It's a living plant, and then you introduce the environment into it. So it's still a living plant if you grow it indoors, obviously, but it's a lot easier to control some of the inputs, the environmentals, fertigation techniques, et cetera. And so for us, as we think about the quality of the researchers we hope to support, what's paramount to them is they get as close to the same product as possible every time, and an indoor grow enables that.
So then are your growers, the folks that are working with you, then working on the genetics? Is that the first step, is that you have that uniformity and GMP, the good manufacturing practices that for the most part the industry collectively is missing? Absolutely, there are the MSOs and growers, in a single state operation adhering to best practices. But
yeah,
the uniformity is not there.
There's two pieces to that. One is on the genetics, and then the other is on the GMP, and both are paramount when you're dealing with a federal cannabis regulatory landscape. Excuse me. And we think this is ultimately the direction of the industry as organizations like the FDA become more involved, if and when some sort of federal permissibility or reform, whatever shape that takes. We think that the cannabis industry will be held to a much higher standard around uniformity, production techniques, et cetera. Much more so probably than you see kind of the patchwork of frameworks around the country today. So on the genetic side, what's most important is stable, well-characterized genetics, much like you would see in any other sort of crop or agriculture product. If it's strawberries or blueberries or wine varietals, farmers need to know that they're getting the same thing every time. For in their instance, kind of the consumer, but for our instance, the patient or the researcher. And ultimately, the FDA regulates largely anything that goes into a body or into a human, or in some instances, even an animal in our country. And part of satisfying the FDA's regulatory requirements, certainly for drug development, is that you demonstrate as much consistency across your products as possible. And the genetics play a large part in that, having stable, well-characterized genetics, as do the growing conditions, and then ultimately the downstream manufacturing conditions. And so, I think the FDA just recently has even opined that if you want to give cannabinoids to a person and make therapeutic claims about them, they have to be produced to the FDA's standard of production, which in most instances is in fact their GMP, good manufacturing practices. So that's a lot of what our team is working on, excuse me, today.
And with the announcement that you have your board, have researchers been reaching out to you? Do you have some projects lined up?
We do. It's been really exciting, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive, and we've been pleasantly surprised. We've always sort of thought and had the thesis, and we did a lot of homework on kind of what we thought the reception from the scientific community would be, but it's pleasantly surprised us. So we're working to support some researchers that are looking at the secondhand effects of cannabis smoke, be it smoked flower or vaporized. We're looking at collaborating with some researchers now, trying to develop cannabis drugs to target chronic pain indications. And so the epilepsy, movement disorders, the research community, if I had to summarize it best, I would say they feel as if they've sort of been sitting on the sidelines as the cannabis industry has matured, and all of the innovation and the therapeutic effects, and in some instances, sort of the less positive effects of cannabis too. They've all been chomping at the bit, sitting on the sidelines, wanting to jump in. And I think we have global aspirations and certainly work with companies around the world, but even just here in the U.S., sort of the home of innovation and the home of pharmaceutical drug development, and look at all that we've done or haven't done with COVID. When you turn that sort of American innovation drive and machine on, it is really powerful. And in our opinion, the same should be happening with cannabis, and this DEA registration or license, it really is the first step in that.
Yeah, I mean, as you alluded to, that with the lack of research or the ability to conduct research that we have, as I've been saying, that there's a missed economic opportunity for the U.S. That other countries are leading in cannabis research. What sort of cultivars or ratios? Any information that you can share about what you're developing and growing?
Sure. Our focus really is on providing clean, consistent, compliant cannabis in whatever form factor or varietal, traditionally THC to CBD, the way most people speak about it, whatever the research community desires. Right now, what we're really seeing, the reception and feedback we're getting is that researchers are focused on, now they have access to high THC products through somebody like us. So they're really focused on what I would call just sort of the initial steps or the foundation to understanding cannabis. So high THC, low CBD, high CBD, low THC, sort of one-to-one varietals. That conversation, even over the past year, is already starting to evolve to more mirror, in my opinion, what consumers are experiencing, either for adult use purposes to increase euphoria or reduce anxiety, or for pharmaceutical drug development purposes, if it's for things like sleep or nausea or pain, things of that nature. And so historically, we hear a lot about consumers focusing on things like flavonoids and terpenes, but we really haven't heard too much about it from the scientific community until recently. And I think the reason is that we're sort of surmising is that the scientific community with respect to cannabis is a couple years behind your traditional cannabis consumer. And the primary reason is that it just takes a long time and a lot of red tape to go through the federally approved research process. And so, researchers coming online today probably wrote a protocol or a grant or submitted a proposal to do their research a year ago or 13, 14, 15, 16 months ago. So kind of what you see coming through the pipe now is, call it a year behind kind of the consumer community. But now that the federal government, and thankfully, we applaud the DEA for finally moving forward, now that they've introduced traditional competition and innovation and enterprise into this mix, we think we'll be able to iterate a lot quicker on what the research community wants, such that it can mirror what folks are using in the dispensaries and around the world.
Okay, so then you have so essentially you're going a standardization, as you said, of the ratios. And would there be a time that that you're developing the plant genetics that would be heavier on something that hasn't been studied that much, like a cannabinoid CBD or the lesser known cannabinoid? So that would be down the road, as second to what you've got going, as you said, what the researchers have been coming to you now for.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
To produce specialized or highly desirable genetics around rare cannabinoids, if it's done through traditional plant Mendelian breeding, or if it's done through kind of what the industry typically refers to as phenohunting or phenotype hunting, that's just a process, and it takes time. So we're excited to be able to be going through that process now, but it does take time.
And then we talked a little bit about, just mentioned it with the federal legalization, and that the draft bill for legalization dropped earlier this summer, the beginning of July, I think it was. And you and I had a conversation where we recognize, as lots of folks in the cannabis industry, particularly those that are focused on medical, is that there wasn't much attention paid to the patients themselves. And what do you have to say about that? What should a legalization bill look like? What's missing? How do we get there?
Yeah, I think those are all sort of multi-billion-dollar, very loaded questions. So I'll try my best at tackling a few of the questions I heard. But I think what's most important to us is that patients and scientists and doctors have access to the best, cleanest cannabis that they know can treat their disease or their symptoms the same every single time, much like you would expect of any other product. If you call something a medicine in this country, it goes through the FDA, and you have to demonstrate that it's safe and effective across a litany of use cases and patient populations. And I personally think it's a disservice to cannabis patients to not give them the same level of confidence that they would have in any other product. sitting from my vantage point, the challenge that I see with the cannabis frameworks is that there's so many interested parties involved, and some of them seemingly have misaligned incentives, or maybe not misaligned incentives, but not the same interest. If it's folks interested in, appropriately so, interested in social justice and undoing the harms of the war on drugs, particularly on people of color, that framework could look a lot different than sort of a traditional medical development framework from the FDA. Similarly, if it's an MSO, then they probably have a vested interest in sort of protecting the brands and the assets that they've developed in their own particular states, sort of their mini fiefdoms. And then similarly, some of the other folks that are interested, if it's alcohol, tobacco, the Canadians, whomever, they probably want to see a more permissive framework that would allow some sort of interstate commerce. And so the challenge, I think, for the industry as a whole is to be able to come together and get on the same sheet of music such that the legislators can count on the support of constituents in a way that says, hey, look, we recognize this isn't the A+ scenario for every single one of these constituent groups or interested parties, but maybe it's a B+ for everybody, or maybe it's an A- for everybody. Right. And that allows some sort of progress to proceed. I think the worst case scenario would be if all the groups hunker down and say, hey, this is exactly what we want, and it's non-negotiable, then at some point you get at loggerheads and nobody gets anything done. And then patients and all the other interested parties don't see the benefit of anything because it just stalls. I think if I were anti-cannabis legalization, I would sit back and say, this is great. Look at all the infighting. Let them just duke it out amongst themselves. And so I hope that the industry can come together to work on a really holistic framework that, and it doesn't have to happen overnight. I mean, it's a sort of step, it's a process with steps. But I hope that we can get there.
In the draft bill, there is some language that's included that provides the opportunity for researchers to purchase cannabis from a dispensary so that it is truly apples to apples. And what impact would that have on BRC? Yeah, so
I think I easily could be mistaken, and these things change seemingly
and it's a draft
by the hour.
It's we're not there yet, but we're
not there yet, or it's even not yet even a draft bill. It's a discussion framework with a bill. It's effectively like an outline or agenda with a bill hasn't actually been introduced. So I think, but I think what you're mentioning is likely part of a larger either infrastructure or transportation bill. And what that would effectively do is say, hey, within 2 years, the federal agencies have to come together and say, how can we allow the research community to access sort of products that are analogous to what's happening in the state market? It can be that they, in some instances, purchase products from dispensaries. It's most likely, based on our interpretation, that is largely driven by or toward impaired driving studies, not traditional drug development, and sort of patient-focused research. It's more along the lines of impairment in public policy, health policy type issues. That doesn't concern us really. I mean, our focus is, again, clean, consistent, compliant cannabis for researchers, and we're focused on sort of on many things, one of which is veteran healthcare. And so if allowing a researcher to work with a dispensary in the longer term helps the patient, then everybody wins from our perspective. I think, when I talk to a lot of people about sort of what the draft framework or discussion framework looks like, I think what they are probably overly optimistic about is timelines and implementations. These things are really hard, and they take a lot of time and a lot of negotiating and a lot of federal government dollars to get anything done. If we look at the Farm Bill as an example, effectively the legalization of CBD, that was mid 2018, so a little over 3 years ago, and we still don't have a defined regulatory framework for cannabidiol. And that's, I don't want to say that cannabidiol is easy, but it's certainly less complex and less potentially polarizing than something like THC. So I think it's going to be a long road. It's going to be hard. It's going to take time. And at the end of the day, sort of all the advocates that continue to work on this we can't lose sight of the vision and the end goal. Otherwise, like, we would just all sort of be intimidated by the length of time. So I think it's going to be long. It's going to be expensive. There's going to be road bumps along the way. But at the end of the day, we just have to stay focused on the mission and keep a patient first attitude.
Yeah, we talked about with the VA, and then particularly, I mean, what this brought you in with, with thank you for your service. And that here you have this massive organization that could be extremely impactful on research. When do you see, I mean, obviously this would be federal legalization to get the VA involved, but I mean, do you see them becoming involved in research, and particularly what we've talked about, how impactful cannabinoid therapy can have on PTSD?
Yes, yes, I do see them being involved for many reasons. If it's optics or veteran care, or just hopefully legitimate altruism that this could help veterans. I think public sentiment is behind it. 92% of veterans say they want the federal government to explore cannabis. At least 1/3 of post September 11th, post 9/11 veterans say they use cannabis to treat their pain or PTSD. So there's just sort of the groundswell of momentum is one example why I think it will happen. The second is that the VA has a statutory mandate from Congress to explore anything that could help with veteran care. And so, in my opinion, if you have 92% of veterans saying, we want this to be studied, at least 1/3 of them saying, hey, we already use this, and Congress has told the VA legally by law, you have to study things, then why wouldn't they be involved? I mean, I think, as a post September 11th veteran, I can go to my doctor at the VA and say, hey, I'm having whatever it is, PTSD, chronic pain, and I'll be prescribed. There's a chance I'd be prescribed a litany of drugs. I could be referred to surf therapy to practice surfing to sort of take my mind off things. I can be prescribed equine therapy to go horseback riding. I can be given a service animal. Why not at least explore cannabis as an alternative healthcare treatment? If we're gonna do all of these amazing programs, why not look at cannabis? And I will say that the VA has done cannabis studies, and they are absolutely ramping up. I mean, there's been some investigatory work done in San Diego and other places around the country, so they are doing it. I just don't think we've seen sort of the whole of VA at the secretary level, at the cabinet level, directive, go explore cannabis. But I do think we'll get there. And then to your point, at this point, it does not require federal legalization. What it requires is a legitimate DEA approved source of cannabis. We can do that now. So there is no excuse for the VA to say, hey, we'd love to study cannabis, but we can't go buy it at a dispensary. They can come partner with us and we can do it tomorrow. So I think this really, in my opinion, it underscores the importance, and again, sort of applaud the DEA, it underscores the importance of issuing these Schedule I registrations or licenses, because that historically has been the catch-22, and the DEA has removed that. So now it's time for all the other federal agencies and companies and universities. There's no excuse anymore. Dive in, go research cannabis. Let's develop products that help as many people as possible. There's no excuse anymore.
Yeah, well, and the future then very bright for BRC. And so what do you have to say about the future of the medical cannabis industry? That's where we came in speaking about it. And again, your colleague, Dr. Brandley, is going to be joining the conversation. But is it the influence of the pharmaceutical industry? Is it the influence of the technology industry? We're going to be getting we're all working hard on this to be able to accomplish this research, to get the physicians engaged and part of this conversation. So what do you think is the most promising piece of the future of medical cannabis?
What really excites us, I don't think any of these things are mutually exclusive. If it's technology or product development or innovation or intellectual property, I think where we're focused and what really excites us is on the traditional drug development realm, whereby someone that needs to use cannabis right now, they probably pay out of pocket. They're not given a prescription. They're given a referral by their doctor. And to us, the next phase of the cannabis industry, the ability to help the most people globally in the most responsible way, is such that you would meet with your doctor, you would be given a prescription if it's appropriate for you. It's certainly not a panacea, but if it's appropriate, you would be referred to your physician. He or she would then issue you a prescription, and then you would go to the CVS and pick it up, and your insurance should pay for it. That to us is the next phase of the medical cannabis industry. And certainly that won't be, right for everybody. There's people that use CBD that don't use Epidiolex, an FDA approved pediatric refractory epilepsy drug. So it's not mutually exclusive. I think the analogy I use is, look, you can have Tylenol and you can have Tylenol with codeine if you come out of a surgery and you need it. And I think both of those sort of products and that framework that can help, in my opinion, a ton of people. And so I think that there's a lot of questions in the direction of the industry, but in terms of the medical cannabis focus, I think the future is very, very bright. And this is really just the beginning.
Yeah, it is an exciting space to be. And we will be speaking exactly about this on September 25th as part of the CannabizMD Cannabis Science and Therapeutics Provider Education Forum, and particularly with George's colleague, Dr. Brandley, on the future of medical cannabis. And so that is September 25th, 10 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. EST time. We're very excited about a keynote that's going to be delivered by Dr. Ethan Russo, who is done so much for the industry and is known for identifying the entourage effect, the application of the cannabinoids with the terpenes and the value of that. So, George, I want to thank you for your time today, and wishing you continued success, and looking forward to following what BRC has an impact on the industry. And thank you so much. And thank you again for your service.
Thank you very much for saying that. It's our pleasure. Thank you.